Hello, everybody, and welcome back. We are reading MK Tech Invasion and Mind Control, Volume 1, and we did Chapter 1.0 earlier. This is Chapter 1.1 What is Language? Language is the intellectual competence that doesn't depend on physical objects in the world, but on the exploration of auditory channels. It is a very complex cognitive psychological function involving several elements such as social communication and intellectual activity. Language is the most used means of communication in the listener. It may or may not be expressed through speech that is individual and in turn is linked to the language idiom. Once learned, it spends most of the time in silent activity. Language gives the individual the ability to talk about things and facts located remotely in space and time. It allows them to solve problems outside the momentary physical situation. Language conveys the concepts, judgments, and reasoning of thought. It's able to transmit emotions or a set of them, and activate those same emotions in the receivers through a grouping of sounds and sequence. Rhythmically organized and metrically constructed in the Western world, reading depends on areas of the brain that process linguistic sounds. In the Eastern system, ideographic reading depends crucially on the centers of pictorial materials. Japanese, for example, has both a symbolic and ideographic reading system, thus housing both reading mechanisms. Some linguistic mechanisms are located in scattered regions of the brain, so language production depends on an adequate process of all the gnostic functions of the brain, among which hearing is the most important of them all. Thought involves language and vision. As far as the blind are concerned, smell, hearing, and touch are their vision. Another way of describing this process is the so-called vocalized thought. The vocalized thought is an important structural function of language that is preceded by initial language learning during childhood and develops along with it concurrently for the rest of life. Vocalized thought can be described as a silent language confined to the brain regions and specialized in this function that is communicated through speech, writing, or sign language. Thus, we have no way of disassociating word, language, vocalized thought, and visual thinking since the word has the associative component of the image. There can be automatic languages without visual thoughts, however. There cannot be vocalized thought without previously acquired language. So the thinking process is related to practically all parts of the brain, mainly to memory, language, vision, and hearing. The capacity for abstraction is the basis of human thought, which is reached at the age of 6. At this age, this skill is acquired through the purpose of dealing with intangible elements such as mathematics. The word and the capacity for abstraction are found at the threshold of the human cosmos, as they functionally characterize mankind. Language is then considered the most refined human skill. The ability to understand language and to communicate depends on a complex series of interactions of speech centers in the brain. Human language allows us to transcend our experiences. As we give a name to an object, it comes into existence for our consciousness and makes the object that is far from us present. And it includes abstract entities that only exist in our mind, such as actions, states, qualities, beauty, sadness, and freedom. The name or word that retains in our memory, the simple pronouncement of a word automatically represents the object to which it refers in our consciousness, thus forming the mental image of said object associated with a word and its real representation. The act of organizing mental processes, the competence of human beings to use different symbolic vehicles for the expression and communication of meanings, distinguishes us from other organisms in nature. The way in which vocalized thought takes place is very complex. It involves areas of the brain related to language, sounds, writing, and speech. These thoughts or ideas, before being converted into sound, are just a vocalization of the expression of thought. They can be contained or sent to be converted into the necessary movements of the mouth, tongue, and vocal cords, initiating the process of speech or hand movements, and manifests itself in writing. When that thought is not sent to the vocal cords and turns into sound, it becomes vocalized thought. The inner voice, the voice of thought, inner conversation, silent thought, sub-vocalized thought, or the voice of the mind. The main ways to stimulate the natural triggering of this vocalized thought are reading, listening, visualizing some external fact that evokes a strong emotional reaction, and the pure act of imagining the organization of mental processes using the internal voice. The first three are external stimuli, and the fourth is an internal cognitive process based on the content already stored by the individual throughout their life. To better understand what vocalized thought is and how it is conceived, simply do something very common in most people's daily lives. Read something. The act of reading with the eyes automatically triggers the beginning of the vocalization process, which is intrinsically linked to language. This process is usually transparent and involuntary. It's difficult for people to pay attention to its execution. To get an idea of the complexity of the neural network involved from reading to vocalized thought, we're going to follow the process that begins in the so-called fovea. The fovea centralis is 1 millimeter in diameter and is located in the center of the retina. It has cones and photoreceptor cells that capture light and transform it into electrical impulses, which are decoded by specialized areas of the brain and have a significantly high resolution, around 7 megapixels, to recognize the details of the letters. We must move our gaze across the page in order to identify at each pause of the eye a word, or two or three, as our eyes are always in motion. The fovea is able to capture several parts of the letters and the brain assembles them in a single image. Our visual system progressively extracts the content of graphemes, syllables, prefixes, suffixes, and radicals from their words. Finally, two important parallel processing routes enter the scene: the sublexical and the lexical routes. The sublexical routes allows you to convert the letters into sounds of the language, the phonemes. The lexical route allows you to access a mental dictionary, where the meaning of the words distributed by memory is stored in a region called visual word form area, which is systematically activated during reading. This is the final hierarchical stage of extracting visual information in the recognition of letters and words. This mental dictionary is the final reading process, which activates the vocalized thought or inner voice, voice of the mind. It is a regular and automatic process that is performed in a continuous, transparent, and effortless way by the brain of every healthy individual on the planet. For the following purposes: reading, pondering, organizing thoughts, ideas, memories, interpreting messages, among others. Vocalized thought is also activated by stimulus in the form of mechanical sound waves, the sound. Hearing also activates the process of vocalizing thoughts. A common example: you're in your car and suddenly the radio station plays a song that you like and whose melody was previously recorded in your auditory memory. As soon as the sound waves reach your ears, the sound is processed and you recognize the melody and lyrics. The act of singing the song, either in a low voice or just in your head, is a process of activating vocalized or silent thought. Another way to activate this mechanism is just thinking without any external visual or auditory stimuli, that is, reflecting internally in daydreams or pondering an event that has affected the individual. We now have the knowledge of what the internal voice is. We started to pay attention to this type of thinking that we usually do not pay attention to, as we never realized that this process could be hacked, violated, or exposed. There is also the second type of thinking that basically depends on the vision and the neural circuits responsible for memory. It's called memory of images or memory of the imagination, which is associated with the visual memory of the word. These are mental images which depend only on the visual memory used for abstract, contemplative thoughts and do not require words. They are visual thoughts that can abstract creativity and transcend time and space. As a matter of fact, the human brain is continually creating mental images. This is one of the fundamental ways in which we orientate ourselves in the world. The mental structuring of images allows the brain to create relations among objects in the physical space that our senses can detect. Based on these images, we choose how to interact with the world. Images are the main source of choosing our behavior. There are two key ways in which the mind receives the sense data with which we create these images. One is through what we see, the other is through the language we hear. This is known as verbal image and has a powerful effect on human behavior. Once a person hears words, the brain immediately processes the sensory data with a coupled image. Whenever we think about something, we evoke a mental image to help create a context based on the reality we live in. Mental images are spatial intelligence centers that take visual perception of the world. To imagine is to work with the image, even with no external visual stimulus, just using visual memory. To better understand the concept and separate one type of thought from the other, as they are closely connected, let's stop for a moment and try this exercise. Close your eyes and imagine a house. It can be a place you've lived in, a residence that recollects a memory of your childhood, or another one that is vivid in your memory. And that's it. Visualizing this house in your mind, the images of the object that designate the house, is your brain's way of virtualizing the visual reality of the environment around you. It's called visual memory, mental image, or imagination image. This memory also makes the visual connection of the symbolism of the word house, since the sign and the symbolism house in no way resemble the object that represents it in our minds, nor its representation in the real world. Thus, the meaning of the word uses the same source of visual memory to contextualize its meaning. Whoa. So, I'm gonna spell out this figure. It's a guy sitting on a rock, and he's looking at the house. Above his head is a thought bubble with a 1 in it, and the 1 is the word house phenomena, the smallest unit of sound in speech. It's composed of the junction of signs. For example, HOUSE. So we can bring it using that. Number 2, he's sitting on the rock looking at a house, and the number 2 is above the house he's looking at. The house in the landscape, the real object that represents it. That's another way we can bring it up. So now we're back to the thought bubble of the word house. House as it is interpreted in the brain, the visual representation of the house in the mind. And 4 is also, it's between the thought bubble and his head, like in the middle. The feeling combined with the object modulated by the emotional state linked to the recording and the recovery of visual memory, which brings emotions to the forefront and are reflected in the posture of the body. The decoding of written language is based on oral language. If the auditory oral language areas are destroyed, we will no longer be able to read normally. We need to keep our hearing intact so that we can hear the vocalization of thought. For this reason, vocalized thought, known as internal conversation using words, has so much influence on mental processes. It merges at once visual memories, sound memories, and abstract feelings, as well as psychophysiological reactions linked to this level of abstraction. I might have to read ahead, because some of these ideas, concepts, and words are kind of out of my wheelhouse. But that finishes chapter 1. And there's still a lot of books, so I'll probably tackle chapter 2 soon. Thank you for joining me today, and I hope to see you soon.